Lisa Riemers, how lovely to have you. We were put in touch from our mutual wonderful friend, Susie O'Neill, a woman who plays strange instruments and gets together interesting, eclectic people. And she put me in touch with you. And I thought, hey, what better idea than to talk with you about what you do? And I haven't had a guest recently speaking about your type of business and what you do. So, Lisa, in your own words, who are you?
Hello, thank you for having me on the show, Minter. I am a communications consultant. I work with businesses and organisations to help improve the way they communicate with their staff and their colleagues, and also get involved in pieces of work that help them improve the way they work. I'm a digital accessibility champion. I like I tend to bridge the gap between communications and technology teams to help organisations make sure that their digital channels, their services, and their communications are accessible and meet the needs of their customers and their employees.
Wonderful. Well, we'll get into all of that in a little bit. But I mean, since podcasts are generally audio, one is often left wondering about the person who's speaking. What do I look like? And for those who aren't listening, who are only listening and not watching on YouTube or something, they'll be like, I wanted to ask the question. So, what kind of color hair do you think Lisa has from just listening to her? And it is full on different. Um, Lovely. I would characterize it actually quite linked to my shirt as it happens. Maybe a sort of a pinky fuchsia type of color, but maybe it's different because my eyes don't see it correctly.
Well, it definitely changes. When it was freshly dyed, it was a combination of a very bright red and neon orange. And as it washes, the colour changes. I can refresh it, and again, the tone kind of changes, but it tends to be somewhere around very bright red or orange or a mixture of the two.
Well, since I worked at L'Oréal in the hair salon business, this is a topic not so far from my understanding. And I understand how color works and on hair and refreshing and semi-permanence and permanent and color and all these other wonderful things. Anyway, that's kind of a fun little a nudge or a nod to my old life. And more importantly, Lisa, before we get into what you're talking about in terms of work, you also are an artist. I'd love to hear about the artist in Lisa.
Yes, I am an artist. And sometimes it feels a bit weird for me to say that because I feel like at times I'm not making a lot of art at the moment. But I go through phases of being more prolific with my art than my comms and consultancy work. I am a painter and a photographer. I use spray paints, but I'm not a street artist. I've got a lot of respect for those that are, but I will use spray paints on a canvas. I also use acrylics. I do a mix of painting whatever I see, really. So it could be a landscape. During lockdown, I did a lot of paintings in my back garden looking up at the sky because I was dreaming of going on a holiday or traveling somewhere, and that resonated with people, I think. Um, but it really varies, and I also take a lot of I take a lot of photographs. I'm a member. I'm a member. I go along to the Colour Walk in London, which is a monthly meetup of creative and colourful people. And the only criteria to go to it is that you like wearing colourful clothes. And so it's a fantastic opportunity to go meet with other people. The walk part of the name is probably a bit of a misnomer because it's more like a colour pose. We get lots of photographers turn up with proper big cameras. I've been quite lazy recently and I tend to use my phone. Um, but yeah, you take pictures of each other, celebrate each other's outfits, support the flea market at Old Spitalfields Market, and it's a really nice way to connect with other creative types.
Mm. Spray painting on a canvas. I don't have any real. I've never spray painted except for occasionally a wall here and there. But I have to imagine that it has to be a fairly large canvas in order to accommodate the width that comes out of the spray can, or are there spray paints that are extremely precise and you're down to a fine-tuned tooth pen?
It can be both. I mean, a bigger canvas is better and easier. But the thing with spray paint, and I didn't realise this till I did a workshop to find out about it, is that the nozzles you can change. So it's a regular one can fits all, but you can get very narrow nozzles. You can get nozzles called fat caps that do a kind of a wider mist that covers more area. And something else I like to use alongside it is you can get acrylic paint pens to do the very fine outlines or details if you need to.
That makes sense. Well, of course, in my old life, we had things like Elnet and and it had lots of nozzles there. And we were very interested in the type of spray that came out, of course. This was spray for hair. Fun to have sort of connecting dots like that, or a little bit disparate from where we are. But let's talk now about what you are up to, Lisa, what you do for a living. One of the things you said in your intro is this idea of being in between the IT and the communication segment. And it feels like two antipods, or at least two sets of people that frequently don't understand one another. And so is that true? And then how do you cross the paths? What is it that allows for the IT to understand comms and vice versa?
I think that's a really good point. And I was talking to someone else about this morning about the differences in how people like to communicate, depending, and there's kind of not quite archetypes, but you often get certain types of communication that's favoured if you work in technology versus comms, say. But I often say that I'm the comsiest person in a technology team or the techiest person working in a comms team. And I think a lot of it is about taking time to understand the other party's point of view and actually talking to them about it. Um, Most of the time, people have a similar end objective and end result. And sometimes I think the communications folk don't understand necessarily the technologist's concerns or queries about a new channel they want to implement or who is actually going to manage something. And I think from a technical side of things, trying to really understand what the comms folk are trying to achieve. Um, Sometimes there's a gap there. It might be the vocabulary people are using. It might be that they work in very different kind of methodologies. But I think a lot of what I end up doing is whichever team I'm in, I spend a lot more time with the other team to find out what's going on.
Yeah, so the lesson there really is go to the others, try to understand them, and also help them understand what you're about. Maybe identifying words that can be confusing in the vocabulary. I mean, in my book, in Artificial Empathy, there's a whole bunch of words that have absolutely different meanings in a tech landscape vocabulary, like container, which any person would know is, but in a tech world has a different context.
Absolutely. And I think even within the tech world, there are very similar, if not identical terms that can do that. You've just reminded me of a conversation that I was having at the time with the chief technology officer at a government department. And we both agreed that we needed to employ a service owner for to look after the new intranet and the internal channels that were being set up as part of the digital workplace. And yes, I was like, absolutely. We know we need a service owner, someone to look after it. And he said to me, I'll write the job description and then I'll come back to you and see if it makes sense with what you're thinking. And it turns out that he was looking at it from the ITIL IT delivery management service framework, which is a completely different technology framework to the government digital services view of a service owner, which is more akin to a product manager or someone who has an oversight of all of the various products and platforms. And we realised we'd been talking to each other. I'd moved out of the digital team and into the technology team at this point, and we'd been thinking we were saying exactly the same words for months. And it was only right before the deadline, when we were about to recruit, that we realised there'd been this big misunderstanding. So even with the best will in the world, these kind of things do happen. And I think one of the ways around that is having that shared glossary or terminology, or not being afraid to ask what you actually mean by that.
Well, at the very least, have a fluid set of communications that avoid, or at least on top of, just the transaction of, hey, can you do this for me? This is what I need. Which is just sort of in the parameter of the work that you're trying to achieve. Maybe have the other conversations, which, hey, listen, what does it actually mean to do IT? How did you get to where you got to? And then what are you trying to do in comms? What are your challenges? And, with your team or with your boss? And what it strikes me, Lisa, in my experience, the biggest sort of red flag problem, or maybe I should say pink flag to your hair, is the brief the brief that is written for the IT people or the creative agency otherwise. But this idea of providing an accurate, useful brief is very difficult to do if you're not from the other world.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's also suggests that a brief was written in the first place.
Crazy woman.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I completely agree. And I think sometimes the opposite challenge is when people get really hung up on making an enormous, very wordy statement of work that goes on for pages but doesn't actually explain what the original problem is. So it
They,
might
they
be
lose they lose the forest for the trees.
exactly, or someone says they come to you with the solution, and the brief is to deliver the solution rather than coming to you with the problem and getting your expertise to be able to help shape what that should look like as an end result.
Well, the other issue, it seems to me, is with regard to understanding the implications of a change or a specific requirement. You can go to the your website guy and you say, all I need you to do is change the color. Well, maybe, or something like that. That sounds simple, but it turns out that you need to think about the color on each of the pages. And by the way, you're going to have a clash of color on this page because you need to think through the issues. And then another one is to misunderstand how much work goes into the programming of some kind of, well, program, and the debugging efforts, and it's not just a simple plug and play, at least not all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think on both sides actually, whether you're in the communication side or the tech side, there's often a lot of hidden labor that goes on. Um, so in the same way as not necessarily understanding the technological implications of a very small change, which actually has a massive impact, I find when I've been on the comms side of things, people often come and say, "Oh, I think it'll only take you 5 minutes. Could you just help me with this role, with this email, say?" And actually, there's a lot of admin that goes on behind the scenes to make sure you've got the right distribution list and you know who they are and it's been up to date. It's been checked that it's up to date. And actually, then the formatting of it all and making sure that it's accessible and it's targeted appropriately. There's quite a lot of work on both sides.
Mm.
And I think it's very easy to underestimate your own workload, but also absolutely underestimate how long it's going to take somebody else to do things.
Yeah, one of the things that drives me bonkers is you copy paste something from one document into, let's say, a Google Gmail, and it looks like it's the right format, but when it goes out, the reception, you have big font, small font, and it's got all over the place. And because in Gmail you don't have a, hey, let's just see what the HTML or the code is behind it, you end up thinking this is what the WYSIWYG, this is what I'm getting, this is what I'm going to send, but it's not. So like you say, there's lots of little niggly things to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've also just reminded me of one of the things that I love about Gmail. There's very few things I love about Gmail, but because it's always in the browser. If you're working on any kind of Google documents or any kind of documents or web pages in the browser, you can paste. There's a shortcut to get Control Shift. Oh no, I've fallen over with what it is. There's a shortcut, so I think it's Control Shift V is pasting unformatted. So then you can apply the formatting in the place that it needs it using the whether it's within Gmail, whether it's within the WYSIWYG editor in your content management system. Um, it's always misleading pasting anything that's been formatted, especially from something like Word, which does
Yeah.
bring its own weird tags and messes
Yeah.
things up elsewhere.
And so when you do that, I mean, presumably, of course, every system will have a different, set of key punches to do, but it's an interesting idea. Paste unformatted. But for example, when you take something that has a link that's embedded, so a hyperlinked word, will it still keep that? Or because I find sometimes when you unformat, it kills those type of formats that were useful in the, let's say, the Word document.
Yeah, pasting unformatted will remove any links, so you would need to then put those back in at the other
Well,
end.
at least it'll be the right format, size, font, and all that. That's cool.
Yeah.
Good eye. Good tip there, Lisa. All right. So you mentioned it just now, this notion of accessibility. And when you and I met the first time, I was like, what do you mean by accessible? Is this sort of like, is it for the people who are hard of hearing? Is it for the people who are have trouble walking? And so when you talk about creating accessible content, accessible design, tell us what that means and what are the challenges around making things appropriately accessible?
Okay, so the thing about accessibility is it's all of the things that you've just listed. Um, there are it's I've spoken to people, particularly like tech vendors or comms people who there's a lot of pushback from people that say, well, I don't think that a blind user would use my software, so we don't need to worry about them. Or I don't think we've got any disabled members of staff in our organisation, so I don't need to worry about that. But the number of people that this affects is really high. And at some point, it affects all of us. So in the UK, the 1 in 4 people are now registered with some kind of disability. And the definition there is if they have a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long term negative effect on their ability to do normal daily activities. So that's people that are registered or classified as disabled. But we could also have temporary disabilities or situational ones. I sprained my foot recently, so for me, getting around was much harder. And I had to navigate new visual systems when I went into a hospital and were looking at a list of the departments on the wall. And I needed to get an x ray, and the department was called imaging. But the lady that told me the directions to go said it's the x ray department. And when I got to the lift, there was a long list of departments, and someone had taped up a little handwritten sticky note to say X-ray against imaging because it's using language that people don't use
Mm.
in their daily work. So so it can affect all of us, and I think another example I found recently, not thinking about digital accessibility, but I don't know if you've been to any restaurants recently where the light is quite low,
Oh,
the
and
the
the menu
menu.
the menu print is too small.
Exactly.
For example,
And designers often push back and say, well, I want it to look a certain way. I want it to have a certain
elegance.
an elegance, a vibe. But it absolutely ruins the vibe when you're sitting around a table and all of you get your phones out and put your torches on because you can't actually read it. Even with reading glasses on, there are thinking about the situation where someone's going to be reviewing or reading what your content is important.
Well,
Um,
we used to face this all the time with shampoos because there are the legal mentions, and then there's a sort of marketing spiel,
yeah,
and there's also another thing called directions to use. And so there's some people with oversized creative egos would say, well, we we don't need to talk so much about directions. Let's just focus on the marketing stuff, or talk in language that's not relevant for people. In any event, at a size that is readable when you have soap in your hair, in your hands, so it doesn't slip, and you got the water pouring down. Is your bottle readable at that level where it counts?
Exactly. And I had a great example recently where thinking back to the online side of things, a lot of the time we're reading content on our phones now. So things need to be optimized for in most cases a smaller screen. You can obviously get much larger mobile screens now, but making sure the important information is available in that first part of the screen is really key. Somebody that I know invited me to the launch of their new book, but I didn't realise that they'd actually included a link to sign up to that launch because it went after their email signature, and I assumed it said register for it here, and the hyperlink was behind the word here, and there were two different links that both said here, but the way they were displayed, because it was in my email, because pictures hadn't downloaded, it just looked like part of a regular email signature. And here doesn't give people the context. So I'd have to read the entire paragraph that came before it to know what here meant. And so, I'd replied to him saying, "Oh, I'd love to come. Please send me the details." And he sent me a one line back saying they're in the original email. And I appreciate people are busy, but that's the point, is that you need to make it as easy as possible for people to read this. Because if you want people to come along or to do an action or to respond to your communication, it's got to be really clear.
Well, I'm hearing you, and I'm feeling like there's a little bit of a not a contradiction, but a paradox. Making it easy, quick, accessible as well. So at some level, it means accessible in my mind, for example, big text. And immediately say what's important. And so you have this challenge of fitting in, especially in small screens, accessibility, because on the one hand, be simple, be direct, give them what they need immediately. On the other hand, there's also a need somehow to have multiple types. So you have to have text to audio for hearing impaired, or reading, visually impaired, vice versa, maybe for people who are deaf. Make sure you have the text that's available on the video. So you have all these other variations you need to do. And so that's sort of like a complexity story. And on the other side, there's a simplicity story of give them quickly what they need right away, especially on a small screen.
I think you're right. It's not, I'd like to say it is all simple, but it shouldn't need to be overly complex, either for you to create or for a user to read. Um, the thing about the way people reading online is they scan headings. You might have heard of it referred to as an F pattern before, where there've been eye tracking studies that have been done 20 years ago, and the Nielsen Norman Group published more information about this more recently. That so people their eyes, they scan along the screen, they look across the heading, then they go down a bit, then they go to the next heading and go down a bit, and trying to break things up so you've got clear headings, you're not using too long a sentence, you split stuff out into bullets, and a lot of it is also being a judicious editor and taking out the words you don't need, or if there are words that you'd like to put in, putting them at the bottom rather than the important links and calls to action. So if people do want more information, they can carry on reading. And if they got everything they needed in the first paragraph, then that's great.
So, so I'm wondering, Lisa, I love that. Which is more aggravating for you? A word that's not needed, or a grammatical error? Like, to they went quick to the pub as opposed to quickly. So maybe the quickly was necessary, but having that grammatical error or spelling mistake, which one gets your gander most?
I think it depends on the context. Um, you know, the tone, the formality, who it is you're speaking to, who you are as a person or the organization that's speaking in the first place. You know, you can absolutely be informal and use more colloquial terms and keep it brief, but I think it's using selecting the right number of words and no more. It's not necessarily cutting it down to not full words, but it's taking out the words that you don't need.
Being judicious about it
Yeah,
in according to what you're trying to achieve.
exactly.
That's pretty cool. All right, so with the clients you work with, Lisa, you can maybe mention some as you wish, in confidentiality being what it is. But how would you describe the biggest challenges they're facing these days in year 2024? Because I mean, obviously, so many things have happened. I'd be curious to see hear what types of challenges your customers are facing the most and bringing you in to help repair or improve.
So, one of the pieces of work I've been doing recently was a really interesting content and copywriting work for an a apprenticeship provider called Digital Native. And they are launching, I think they might have launched it now. It's a level 7, so a master's level apprenticeship for AI data specialists. So AI is something that's being talked about in every organization, and I could fill up the whole podcast about my views on AI, but I don't know if we want that.
Well, I
But
do. I was actually my next. I was gonna. That's my next question. So
okay,
save that space.
okay. So one of their challenges is thinking about who it is that's going to be reading their literature and who it is that's actually buy it, like who is going to get them to deliver these services to their organization, because they know a lot about AI and they know a lot about data and they know a lot about the technical side of things. And thinking about that, the purchase process and who's going to get in touch. It could be that there's a technical lead that knows all about that, but it also might be someone in the HR and learning development side of things who needs to know that it meets certain criteria, but actually they might not be uh, as clear as to what the content is. So it's trying to write what can be quite technical content in ways that the people that need to read it can understand.
Right. So understanding your audience and bringing to them what they need, which sometimes is, difficult. There's difficult concepts, but you need to bring them. So wordsmithing sounds like the sort of a way of just summarizing that problem.
It can be words. It might also be diagrams. It might be um, using the same words but breaking it down into the lists of, what are the criteria, a short bulleted list. Who is this applicable for? How long does it last? It's really breaking things down into pieces of information so that, again, if someone's scanning it, they get all the information they need.
Hmm. I'm just going to park the AI 1 second, but makes me consider also with so many things going on, so many changes, so many platforms, apps, possibilities, eh, and of course AI amongst that. I read recently that there are 90 new AI apps hinged on these new LLMs, large language models that are being developed every day. So I'm wondering to what kind of references you use to stay abreast. What are the resources or sources that you recommend for staying abreast in your space, Lisa?
I think there are so many resources available, and I read a lot online. I think sources like it's been interesting reading what McKinsey has to say about AI. They've always got a lot to say about whatever latest trends there are in the industry. I think it was McKinsey that said recently that they expect 20% of revenues of all businesses in 2024 to come from AI and AI related products. Um, Nielsen Norman Group are really good as a reference point for user-centered design and the trends in how people use the internet and how to make sure that your digital products meet people's needs. Um, there's lots of resources available for thinking about accessible content. The Business Disability Forum in the UK, it's a paid for membership place, but and where I was at a previous organisation, we were members. They've also got a lot of free resources available. Um, and also there are a lot of really helpful resources on gov.uk. Um, there have been a lot of teams working for UK government thinking about making accessible content, talking about accessible design. Um, and there are lots of resources on there. And I've spent just on it from an accessibility point of view. There's been so many resources that I keep coming back to that I've pulled them together into a web page on my own website. Helpful for me as a reference point and also for other people.
That's brilliant. I'm going to make sure to put all those and your link into the show notes. Because I mean, to your point, really, there's so many choices that it can be overwhelming. And somehow to have a curated list can help, at least, it's reasonable to think that you can get through a short list, reasonable only to get us through a short list of articles that hopefully cover enough of what you need.
Yeah, and also thinking back on the AI side of things, the Alan Turing Institute in the UK has been doing some really interesting thinking about this. There's a process-based governance report or methodology for how you implement AI in your organisation, which I know a lot of people. It was the report they put together for Department for Business and Trade. But they've got a lot of resources on their website, and there are training resources available to help you think about how AI might work in your organisation. And that's certainly been a reference point for me and some of my clients recently.
Yeah, and this really, we need to, hit the egg on the head with regard to AI, because obviously AI is usable in so many ways. The McKinsey report is saying 20% part of the, how people are making their business. As people who are in the knowledge worker area creating content, the if people today haven't tried to write an article through a chat GPT or whomever else, it's almost like they'd be in the dark ages today. So what is your approach with how to help customers, people who are in the comms business, to using AI effectively? What are the big red flags to be worried about?
So, in terms of writing aids, there are things that AI can do that are already baked into a lot of the products that we're using. So whereas I used to recommend for people who want to look at their, if they want to do a kind of a readability check to see if they're using too long a sentence or if they could be using some simpler words and phrases, there's an app called Hemingway that was a great, it's not generative AI, but it's a good editor. But actually, Microsoft Word has a really good built-in editor now that gives you a score. It makes some suggestions to improve your sentence construct and maybe do a little edit itself. It does seem to favour the Oxford comma, which doesn't always work for people, but that it's really useful. And the Microsoft PowerPoint as well. There are some AI designer elements in their PowerPoint designer that make it much easier to format some images on a slide or to come up with some suggestions for the layout of the page. Um, However, the flip side of that is I've got a really good friend who's recently been made redundant as a PowerPoint designer. And part of her redundancy process has been teaching other people in the organisation how to use PowerPoint better. But she's basically being usurped by AI. And I think she's not the only one. I've heard from other comms people. There was a team of people recently who 4 out of the 5 team were let go and one person left behind to be able to review the outputs of what large language models like ChatGPT were giving them. And I think there's so many. it can be so useful for formulaic content, or if you've got something there in front of you, turn this information into a very quick press release. And then you've got something to edit. It can speed up the formulaic content creation process quite easily for people. And then the flip side of that is making sure that you're still adding value as a human in the process. Because otherwise, why would you be doing this when somebody could just use a tool? I think where one of the biggest challenges that AI still has is that it makes stuff up. It doesn't have any knowledge itself. It looks at the data or the information that it's got access to and will respond to whatever query you've given it um, with the limited knowledge it has. Um, I used I was trying out one of the older versions of ChatGPT a while ago, and I asked about planning a travel itinerary because I'd heard somebody else had found it was very good for that. And I asked it to give me a craft beer bar in walking distance of a hotel in Lisbon, I think it was. And it gave me a bar, but it was a 45-minute walk away. And 45 minutes back to your hotel when you've had a couple of beers might not be walking distance. So I said, is there anything any closer? Because when you start the process off, you can start refining down the responses you get. And it gave me another one. I was like, okay, that sounds interesting. And I went to look it up and it didn't exist. It didn't exist in the town at all. It was the name of a bar in a different city, but it gave me an address in the middle of a freeway and it completely hallucinated the answer. And when I interrogated it and I said, are you sure that that's the bar there? It said, oh no, my mistake. Sorry, it doesn't exist at all.
Why didn't you check it in the first place, you idiot?
Exactly. And I think that's a very harmless really example of how it can make things up. I saw a video being shared on Twitter this week about the largest 10 Tesco's stores in the UK. And it's so AI has been used to generate this video, which has a series of images of the 10 stores that it's listed in question. It's being sung in a 70s disco funk type thing, and it's counting down from the top 10. And I looked at it and said, oh, this is quite fun and enjoyable. I wonder where it's got it from. And then the one that came in at number two is my local Tesco's Extra. And it's like, I know for sure that that is not the second biggest in the UK because it's reasonably large, but it's not the biggest. And I went to look it up and I couldn't find a comprehensive list of the Tesco stores by footprint, but I was able to find enough evidence to say that it's just scraped together what Wikipedia says, plus a few other sources, and made it up. So to be really careful when you're using these things, because again, that's another fun example. But there've been legal precedents from the airline in Canada whose chatbot on their website told somebody the wrong information about their bereavement travel policy. And the airline went to court and tried to claim that the chatbot was a separate legal entity and they weren't liable for it. I
I mean,
think
even if they win, that is a pretty a crummy approach.
exactly. And they didn't win. And they were told actually that this is something that you've deployed and you need to take responsibility for it. So I think it's important for everybody to know, at least get to know it from a distance. You don't have to be using it every day, but you need to be able to articulate what the benefits and limitations are to make sure that if somebody else in your business is starting to do this and they want your input, that you're able to give that feedback to them and that anything that's been implemented has been fully tested, um, and you've actually got a governance process in place so that once this new product has been launched, somebody is responsible for keeping the information up to date and also the making sure that the latest deployments are, as the models get updated, that's all managed. Um, but yeah, knowing the limitations, but also the opportunities with it is important, I think.
Well, indeed. Where I was thinking, what I was thinking about while listening to you is how the way you might look at or use an AI has relevance to how we might be as a leader of people also. So, for example, taking responsibility, if you're the leader, the buck stops here. You should take responsibility for the failures that your team have made and lean into that. On the reverse, you can't take credit for something that you personally didn't do. So be transparent that you used AI to get some way along the way, but take responsibility for the final product, whether it's through a chatbot or something you've done. And the other thing which is interesting is this idea of feedback, which you can talk about in the notion of a refined prompt. But the idea of giving feedback, any boss should also be giving and receiving, by the way, feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. I think having any kind of feedback mechanism in place is good business sense generally for businesses and for leadership. But I think it's particularly important in terms of these kind of products. They're only as good as the data that they're trained on. And a lot of the time, a lot of humans do need to be involved in that training process, either explicitly as part of your implementation, or a lot of them already have been involved as part of the building of the tool in the first place.
And that notion you mentioned about also needing to have appropriate governance and put in place. That's probably a whole other chapter we can talk about for on. I wanted to just finish on some sort of more practical elements since I've been blogging for 20 years and fastidiously trying to stay up to date with SEO. And there's sort of a raging debate in my mind anyway, whether content is king or queen to SEO.
That's a great question. And I think actually in today's age of AI generated content, it's really important to be able to write useful information. Um, if you're only thinking about things in terms of SEO, a lot of the time it's being crawled by the Google robots. And if it's been generated by AI, you've got AI writing for Google's bots. And actually, is any of this really useful for humans, or is it just generating data for someone to point to in a report?
And if I might add, to what extent is it differentiable? Because it gets as diluted and common as you go down and use more of these types of tools.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think understanding it goes back to understanding your users and what people want and what people need, and making sure that what you're writing answers their questions. Do you know what's important in certain in whatever your specialism is, and making sure that if it's at least useful, it could be that it's useful for you, in which case it might be useful for other people. Because my accessibility resources page um, ranks quite highly in search results, which I was pleasantly surprised about. But I've spent quite a lot of time pulling those resources together, and it's mainly about accessible content, but it's really interesting to see that it holds its own against some more established institutions who you'd think would have more credibility online.
I get, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 requests a day for people to publish on my website, free articles or paid articles, and then or backlinks to their site. Obviously, there's a whole industry that's out there. I'm sort of away from that game in general because just I can't be asked to do all that anymore. But you who must be closer to it, what are the types? Where are we with SEO? I mean, is it still like a changing every day kind of thing? With Google in particular, and within SEO, what should people be the most concerned about or thinking about in terms of making their site visible?
So there've been a few reports recently of how the quality of Google search results in particular has gone down over the last few years, partly because if you've tried searching recently, you'll probably notice that the first several links are all paid ads. They're not organic
Indeed.
results.
Yeah. Google wants
Um,
money.
exactly. Um, and the algorithm changes every couple of years. It prioritizes things, it deprioritizes things. A lot of the core good web sense though will help you regardless of an algorithm change. It's writing. So going back to that accessibility thing, it's not just about it's making it really clear what your web page is about. It's using headings because those headings are crawled by the bots. So if your headings clearly articulate what this page content is about, then it helps from a search results point of view, as well as when people have actually found the page and they can navigate it more easily. um, Trying to avoid big overblown images that have got a massive file size and slow down people's browsing. I know several years ago that was one of the things that one of the updates from Google was really penalizing was slow performing websites. And I think it comes back to providing useful information that's been clearly signposted and is clearly structured, and it's using plain language, and plain language being the language that your audience understands the first time they read it. It's not necessarily dumbing things down into simple easy read language, although there are cases when you do need easy read content. But using the words that people are searching for will help you, and it means that what you're writing is more relevant to what their intention is. So making sure that you've got image descriptions is also, it's helpful for SEO as it is for people that are using assistive technology like a screen reader. It's not a place to go and stuff in a bunch of keywords, but it is a place to be able to put a description of what that image is. So if someone is searching in Google's image results, if you've got a description of the image against the image, it's more likely to sharpen the results if it's got a term in that people are looking for. Um, but ideally, when you're thinking about your image description that's in the alt text, it is contextually appropriate. So if you've got a blog about visiting Australia recently, and you've got a picture of the Sydney Opera House, the context of it could be Sydney Opera House on a grey day. Or if you're writing about your trip, it could be a picture I took of Sydney Opera House from the botanical gardens opposite. It's giving people enough information that if they can't see the image, they know what the image was of. But also, then it helps people find the image in the first place and then find your content too.
Right. So, is there not some sort of artificial intelligence that could go through my site, Lisa, and add in the left out texts that I have probably only done one out of every 20 images? I mean, I have 2,200 posts and God knows how many media in there that probably have none of that. Is there some AI, help me, that can go in there and contextualize some good text, or is that just going to have to be manual?
Some AI can do a bit of a job of it. So if you again, PowerPoint as an example, um, will suggest a description for the image, but it's still not normally very good. Google Photos has long had this ability to understand what the images are of, and I love it because when I search for pictures in my Google Photos um, account, I can search for hats or
Yeah.
cats or some writing that I know was in a picture that I took of someone's slides. I can find it just by because it recognizes what's in there. But most of the time, the descriptions to make it really accessible, it still needs to convey the intention that you had. So it might say a screenshot of a computer, but the purpose of your screenshot might be the text that's on the screen and it's showing something in particular to the user. And if you don't pull out the useful text, then the descriptions, it's actually almost better not to have it because it's not told you any more information and it's just filler content.
They're just
Uh,
taking the name of the file, screenshot 2024-12-2. Well,
yeah.
that's pretty mild. All right, well, Lisa, really fun having this chat with you. I really appreciated it. I enjoyed getting into the weeds in an area that yeah, I used to be very fluent in, but I feel less and less able to stay up with it. And things are changing so much. So how can someone hire you, track you down, follow you? Don't mean track you, but follow you, hire you.
So you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm Lisa Riemers. You can find me on my website, lisariemers.com. I'm also on Blue Sky, Lisa Riemers, whatever the Blue Sky link is, and on the artist formerly known as Twitter as Lisa Riemers.
Hmm. Very consistent personal branding. Good on you, Lisa. Thank you so
Thank,
much for coming on.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. It's been lovely.